Jonathan Carter was driving home after a long day. The sun was setting, painting the sky with warm orange and pink colors. His car moved smoothly down the quiet road in a nice neighborhood. He wasn't speeding, wasn't breaking any rules, just enjoying his drive. Then he saw flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Jonathan frowned. Why was he being stopped? He had done nothing wrong. Still, he pulled over to the side of the road, turned off his engine, and kept his hands on the steering wheel. He had been taught to always stay calm during traffic stops, even when they didn't make sense. A police officer, Officer Brad Mitchell, stepped out of his patrol car. He was a tall man with a serious expression. His uniform was neatly pressed, and his badge shone under the streetlights. But there was something in the way he walked, like he had already made up his mind about Jonathan. Jonathan rolled down his window as the officer approached. "License and registration," Officer Mitchell said, his tone sharp. Jonathan remained polite. "Of course, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Officer Mitchell ignored the question. Instead, he looked around the car, then back at Jonathan. "This your vehicle?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow, but kept his voice steady. "Yes, it is." The officer didn't respond right away. He seemed to be thinking about something. Then he leaned slightly closer. "Where are you coming from?" Jonathan sighed internally. This wasn't a routine question for a traffic stop. He knew that. "Still," he answered, "just heading home from work." The officer nodded slowly, but something in his eyes said he didn't believe him. He looked at the expensive car, then back at Jonathan. "What kind of work do you do?" Jonathan kept his hands visible, resting calmly on the wheel. He didn't want to escalate the situation. "I work in law." Officer Mitchell's mouth twisted slightly, like he was suspicious. "Aha. And where exactly do you work?" Jonathan took a slow breath. "The state government." For a brief moment, there was a flicker of hesitation in the officer's eyes, but he quickly masked it. He seemed determined to find something wrong. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Mitchell ordered. Jonathan blinked. "Excuse me." "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his voice firm. Jonathan could feel the shift. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. It was something else. But he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded and slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. As he stepped out, another patrol car pulled up behind them. 2 more officers arrived. Jonathan looked at the scene around him and realized something. This was going to be a long night. Jonathan stood beside his car, his eyes calmly meeting the officers. The night air was cool, but he felt the heat of the situation. 3 officers now stood around him, and Officer Mitchell had stepped back a little, his arms crossed. "Let's get this straight," Officer Mitchell said, his voice cold. "You're telling me you just work in law. That doesn't tell me much." Jonathan remained calm. "That's correct. I'm an attorney, and I work for the state government." Mitchell narrowed his eyes. "Aha. And where exactly do you work? Or is that a secret too?" Jonathan didn't flinch. He understood the officer was pushing to make him say something that would give him a reason to dig deeper. "I work in the state attorney general's office. I deal with legal matters for the state." The officer's face didn't change. Jonathan had expected this. The officer didn't seem satisfied with the answer, as if he thought there was something suspicious about it. He glanced down at Jonathan's car, which was parked neatly at the curb, and then back at him. "So, you're telling me you're a lawyer and you drive this car?" Mitchell's voice had a hint of disbelief, as if questioning whether someone who worked in law could afford a nice car. Jonathan was used to this kind of questioning. It wasn't unusual for people to make assumptions based on appearances, especially about a black man driving an expensive car. But it still didn't sit right with him. "Yes, officer," Jonathan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's my car, and I can afford it through my hard work." Officer Mitchell didn't say anything for a moment. He kept glancing at the car as if trying to find some evidence of wrongdoing. But there was none. Jonathan hadn't done anything wrong. "Step back and let me take a look inside," the officer ordered suddenly. His tone was sharp, and it felt like an accusation. Jonathan took a deep breath, his hand still resting at his side. "Am I being detained, or am I free to go?" Mitchell paused. The question had clearly thrown him off. He didn't have a real reason to hold Jonathan here, but that didn't stop him from trying. "You're not free to go yet," Mitchell said, his voice tight. "I'm just checking things out." Jonathan shook his head slightly. "You don't have a reason to search my vehicle, officer. I'm not doing anything wrong." But instead of responding, Mitchell motioned to one of the backup officers, who was now standing a little farther away. The other officer nodded and began walking over to the car. Jonathan could feel the tension building. The officers were acting like he was a criminal, though he had done nothing to deserve it. Why had this stop turned into an interrogation? Why were they treating him like a suspect? He knew this wasn't just about him being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was about something bigger, something that had nothing to do with his actions. As the officer rummaged through the car, Jonathan couldn't help but think, this was the kind of situation that could happen to anyone, but for him, it was far more familiar than it should be. The seconds felt like minutes, and Jonathan's patience began to wear thin. He had a right to know what was happening, and he had a right to be treated fairly. Jonathan stood by his car, watching as the officer began inspecting his vehicle. He couldn't understand why this was happening. He had done everything by the book. He was calm, cooperative, and had answered every question politely. Yet the officer continued to act as though he was guilty of something. As the officer moved around the car, Jonathan glanced over at the other officers. They stood silently, watching the scene unfold. One officer, in particular, seemed to be whispering something to the officer in charge, but Jonathan couldn't hear their conversation. He knew this wasn't the kind of stop that would end quickly. A thought crossed Jonathan's mind. What if they didn't know who he was? What if they didn't realize he was the state attorney general? Jonathan took a breath, trying to stay calm. He had been in tough situations before, but this felt different. It was as though the officer was determined to make a point, but Jonathan didn't know what that point was. Officer Mitchell finally walked back to him. He was holding Jonathan's driver's license in his hand, his eyes cold and distant. "You know," Officer Mitchell said, his tone almost mocking, "I don't think I've ever seen an attorney drive a car like this. Maybe it's not your car after all." Jonathan felt his patience starting to wear thin. Was this man really questioning him based on his appearance? "I told you it's my car," Jonathan said calmly. "And I told you what I do for a living. You can check it out if you want. But this is a waste of time." But the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice raising slightly. "Look, I'm just doing my job. If you don't want to cooperate, I can get you in more trouble. You're acting like you're above the law." Jonathan blinked in surprise. Had the officer really just said that? He wasn't acting above the law. He was simply asking for fairness. He was asking to be treated the same as anyone else would be in this situation. "I'm cooperating," Jonathan said, keeping his voice steady. "But I'm also exercising my right to question why I'm being treated differently." The officer smirked. "Rights, ha. Well, I don't think you understand the situation here. You think you can just walk away because of who you are." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. Did the officer know who he was? Jonathan wasn't sure, but his suspicion was growing. The way the officer was speaking to him felt personal. It felt like this wasn't just about the stop. Before Jonathan could respond, the sound of another car pulling up interrupted them. It was a marked car, and this time, it wasn't another patrol car. It was a higher-ranking officer. Lieutenant Graves stepped out, his face serious but not angry. He looked at Jonathan, then at Officer Mitchell. The change was instant. Graves recognized Jonathan immediately. "Brad, what's going on here?" Lieutenant Graves asked, his tone calm but firm. Jonathan didn't say anything. He simply stood there, waiting for the officer to realize what he had just done. He knew it was coming. Officer Mitchell didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked from Graves to Jonathan, his face growing pale. He finally saw it, the badge on Jonathan's ID, the name on the documents he had just read. And in that moment, it became clear. Jonathan wasn't just a random man being stopped. He was someone far more important. And the officer had no idea who he had been speaking to all along. The air felt heavier now, the tension thick. Lieutenant Graves walked toward Jonathan and Officer Mitchell, his boots crunching against the gravel. As he approached, Jonathan could see a change in the officer's demeanor. Graves had recognized Jonathan immediately, and it was clear from the way Mitchell stiffened that he had realized his mistake. Graves stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning the situation. He glanced first at Officer Mitchell, then at Jonathan. There was no anger in his voice, but the weight of the moment was heavy. "Brad," Lieutenant Graves said in a calm, measured voice. "What exactly is going on here?" Officer Mitchell opened his mouth but quickly closed it. He looked over at Jonathan, his face now flushed with embarrassment. It was too late to take back what had just happened. Jonathan remained silent for a moment. He wasn't in the mood to say much. The situation had gone far enough. And now that Graves was here, he didn't feel the need to explain himself. The officer had already crossed a line. Finally, Jonathan spoke up. "I'm not sure what's going on either, Lieutenant," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet frustration. "But I've been stopped for no reason, questioned like I'm a criminal, and treated with disrespect." Graves turned his attention to Mitchell, his face becoming more serious. "Brad, do you know who this is?" Mitchell hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking nervously to Jonathan. He shook his head, not speaking. He had no idea. Graves' eyes narrowed. "This is Jonathan Carter, the State Attorney General. I think you owe him an explanation." Jonathan watched as Mitchell's face drained of color. He could see the officer realizing the enormity of his mistake. It was almost painful to watch, the guilt, the regret, just seconds after it was too late. For a long moment, there was silence. The only sound was the soft rustle of the wind through the trees and the faint hum of distant traffic. Jonathan could feel his heart beating a little faster, not from fear, but from the realization that he wasn't just a regular man being unfairly stopped. He was someone in a position of power, and that, for some reason, made the officer treat him differently. Finally, Officer Mitchell spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know." Graves nodded, understanding. "But it didn't make the situation better." "That's clear," he said. "But it's too late to undo what just happened." Jonathan stood tall, his posture straight. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to allow this officer's mistakes to go unnoticed. "I'm sure you didn't intend to disrespect me, but the truth is, this kind of thing happens all the time. People get treated unfairly simply because of the color of their skin, and it's got to stop." Mitchell swallowed hard, clearly unsure of what to say. He was caught. His assumptions about Jonathan's worth had been wrong, and now he was trapped in the mess he had created. Graves turned to Mitchell one last time. "You'll need to sort this out, Brad. There will be a report filed. And from now on, I suggest you treat everyone with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are." Jonathan looked at Graves, then back at Mitchell. He wasn't going to let this just fade away. The officer's actions needed to be acknowledged and addressed. He would make sure of that. As the scene settled, Jonathan could feel his anger starting to cool. The situation had taken a turn, and it was clear that karma had begun its work. The silence hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Jonathan could see that Officer Mitchell was struggling to collect himself. He kept looking between Lieutenant Graves and Jonathan, his mind racing as he tried to find the right words, though there were none that could undo what had just happened. Lieutenant Graves stood firmly, his expression unreadable. "Brad, I need you to step aside," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm going to handle this from here." Officer Mitchell's eyes widened, and for a moment, He seemed unsure of what to do. He had been the one in charge, the one calling the shots, and now that control was slipping away. Slowly, he stepped back, his shoulders slumped in resignation. He wasn't in charge anymore. Jonathan remained silent, watching the officer's every movement. It was clear to him that Officer Mitchell had been caught off guard by the truth. He had assumed Jonathan was just another ordinary person, someone he could treat however he wanted. But now, reality had slapped him hard, and he was left to face the consequences of his own actions. Lieutenant Graves turned to Jonathan, his gaze softening just slightly. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Mr. Carter. This should never have happened." Jonathan nodded, his frustration still simmering under the surface. "I'm used to it, but that doesn't make it right." Graves sighed and looked over at Mitchell, who was standing a few feet away now, still looking lost and unsure. "Brad," Graves said sharply, "you need to head back to the station. We'll talk about this later." Mitchell's face flushed red with embarrassment. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he muttered, "Yes, sir." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his patrol car, the weight of the situation now fully hitting him. Jonathan watched him leave, his eyes narrowed. This was far from over. Just because the officer had walked away didn't mean the incident would be forgotten. He knew that this was just the beginning of what would likely become a much bigger issue. As Mitchell drove off, Graves turned to Jonathan again. "I'll make sure this gets handled, I promise you that. You won't be treated like this again." Jonathan gave a small nod. "Thank you, Lieutenant." Graves looked around, making sure the situation was under control. "I'll be filing a full report, and this will go through the proper channels. You're going to be contacted soon by Internal Affairs." He paused for a moment, then added, "You have my word." Jonathan felt a small sense of relief, but it didn't erase the sting of what had just happened. He had been unjustly questioned, searched, and humiliated simply because of the assumptions that Officer Mitchell had made based on his appearance. As Graves walked back to his own car, Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension that had built up inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure that incidents like this didn't happen to anyone else. It was about standing up, even when the odds were against you. The night was still, and Jonathan knew there was more to come. But for now, he'd take a small victory in knowing that the officer's mistake hadn't gone unnoticed, and that justice, in one form or another, was on its way. The scene had quieted, but Jonathan's mind was still buzzing. His thoughts kept circling back to the same questions. Why had Officer Mitchell treated him this way? Why had his appearance alone been enough for the officer to assume guilt? Jonathan wasn't sure if he would ever get a clear answer, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let this go. He wasn't the type of person to let an injustice slide, especially when it was so clear. As Lieutenant Graves headed back to his car, Jonathan stood by his own vehicle, his arms crossed, watching the situation unfold. Officer Mitchell, still clearly flustered and uncomfortable, sat in his patrol car for a moment, his eyes glued to the dashboard. The officer was trying to collect his thoughts, no doubt reflecting on how quickly the situation had turned against him. Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. It wasn't just the officer's behavior that bothered him. It was the system that allowed it to happen. He knew this wasn't the first time someone had been treated unfairly because of their appearance. It wasn't the first time that assumptions were made based on race, wealth, or status. After a few minutes, Officer Mitchell slowly got out of his patrol car and walked back toward Jonathan. His head was down, and his steps were slower this time. The confident swagger he had earlier was gone, replaced by a visible discomfort. "Mr. Carter." Officer Mitchell's voice was softer now, lacking the sharpness it had earlier. "I owe you an apology." Jonathan didn't respond right away. He didn't need to say anything for the officer to realize how serious the situation was. The mistake had been made, and now it was time to face the consequences. "I didn't know who you were," Mitchell continued, his words coming slowly. I shouldn't have acted the way I did." Jonathan could tell the officer was struggling to find the right words. It wasn't just about apologizing. It was about realizing the weight of what he had done. The officer wasn't just apologizing for one mistake. He was beginning to understand that his actions were part of a much larger problem. "You shouldn't have treated me like that in the first place," Jonathan said finally, his voice calm but firm. "You shouldn't have made assumptions about who I am or why I'm here." Mitchell nodded, his face filled with regret. "I understand. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I wasn't thinking clearly. It was wrong." Jonathan watched the officer carefully. He could see the sincerity in Mitchell's eyes. The officer wasn't just trying to save face. He was genuinely remorseful. But that didn't change the fact that Jonathan had been treated unfairly. "I get that," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "But it doesn't erase the fact that this happens every day. People like me, who look different, get treated like criminals simply because of how we appear. And that needs to change." Mitchell seemed to take in Jonathan's words, his eyes slowly meeting Jonathan's. There was a moment of silence, and in that silence, the officer seemed to understand something deeper, something beyond just a simple apology. "I promise, Mr. Carter," Mitchell said quietly. "I'll do better. I'll learn from this. I won't let this happen again." Jonathan nodded, still feeling the weight of the moment. "I hope so, officer. I hope you do." The officer took a deep breath and walked away, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the realization had hit him all at once. Jonathan stayed where he was, his thoughts racing. He knew the road ahead would be long, but this was a step in the right direction. The officer had taken responsibility, but now it was time for action. As the night settled into quiet again, Jonathan felt a small sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could start to change. The night was still, and the city streets were quieter now. The events that had just unfolded were far from over, but for Jonathan, there was a sense of relief. Officer Mitchell had apologized, and though it didn't erase the unfair treatment, it felt like a small victory. He knew this wouldn't be the last time someone would have to face this kind of discrimination, but it was a start. As Jonathan climbed into his car, the cool night air still lingering outside, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and saw that there was a message from his office. The report was already being filed. He wasn't surprised. It had happened quickly. The police department had already begun investigating the incident, and things were moving faster than he had expected. Jonathan took a deep breath. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the system itself. It was about the ways people were unfairly treated every day, based on assumptions and prejudice. He knew he couldn't fix everything in one night, but tonight he had made a difference. Later that evening, the media caught wind of what had happened. News outlets started picking up the story. The headline wasn't about Jonathan's expensive car or his position. It was about what had happened when assumptions went too far. It was about the unfair treatment that people faced simply because of their appearance. The story spread quickly, and soon enough, the pressure started mounting. People began calling for change. They were demanding answers, and they wanted the department to be held accountable. Jonathan could see the ripple effect. His experience had opened a door, one that many people had been trying to push through for years. The next morning, the pressure on Officer Mitchell was already visible. Internal Affairs had launched an official investigation, and the officer was now under review for his actions. The department had made it clear there would be consequences for the way Jonathan was treated. The media had picked up the story, and now the public was watching. Mitchell's earlier apology couldn't undo the damage caused by his actions, and now there would be real repercussions. Jonathan knew this was just the beginning. The officer's apology had been a start, but it was what happened next that would make the difference. Would the department stand by him? Would they take real steps to address the issue of racial profiling? Or would this just be another moment where things were swept under the rug? As Jonathan sat in his office the next day, he found himself looking at the headlines, reading the responses from the public, and considering what was next. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about something much bigger than one encounter. It was about a system that needed to change, about standing up for people who didn't have the same voice. The day dragged on, but Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. As much as he wanted to move on, he knew he had to see this through. He had already taken the first step, and now it was time for others to do the same. Karma had already begun its work, but Jonathan was determined to keep pushing forward until the change he believed in was real. By the end of the day, the department announced that new training programs on racial bias would be implemented across the entire police force. It was a small but important victory. Jonathan had fought not only for himself, but for the many others who had been treated unfairly simply because of how they looked. The battle was far from over, but the tide had started to turn. A few weeks after the incident, the dust had begun to settle, but the impact of what had happened continued to resonate. Officer Mitchell had resigned from the force, though not in the way he had hoped. The pressure from the investigation, the media attention, and the public outcry had all led to the inevitable conclusion. His career in law enforcement was over, but more importantly, his actions had sparked a much-needed conversation that could no longer be ignored. Jonathan had been following the developments closely. He had been in touch with Lieutenant Graves and the department's leadership. The investigation into Officer Mitchell's behavior had concluded, and it had revealed not just individual errors, but a systemic issue within the department that needed to be addressed. The department had pledged to reform, introducing new policies aimed at preventing bias and ensuring that officers treated all people equally, regardless of their background. Though Jonathan was satisfied with the outcome, he knew this wasn't enough. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about the larger issue of discrimination, both in law enforcement and society as a whole. He continued to push for more transparency, more training, more accountability. The department had taken the first steps by instituting mandatory training on bias, profiling, and the importance of treating every individual with respect. The changes were rolling out slowly but steadily, and Jonathan was pleased to see that officers were beginning to take the training seriously. The department was also working with community leaders to improve relationships between the police and the people they served, which Jonathan saw as a crucial step in rebuilding trust. As for Officer Mitchell, his resignation had come with a heavy price. His actions had cost him not only his job but his reputation. Jonathan could see that the officer had regretted his behavior, but regret wasn't enough to undo the harm that had been done. Still, Jonathan hoped that Mitchell would learn from this experience. Perhaps in time, he could become an advocate for change, helping to prevent future mistakes. But for Jonathan, the real victory wasn't in seeing one officer leave his post. The victory was in knowing that his actions had contributed to something larger than himself. It was about creating a space for people to feel safe, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. As the weeks turned into months, Jonathan's role in pushing for police reform became a beacon of hope for others who had faced similar experiences. He had used his position not for personal gain, but to bring about real change. He had taken a stand, and that stand had rippled out, inspiring others to do the same. In the end, justice had been served, not just in the case of Officer Mitchell, but in the very real sense that people across the state were now talking openly about bias, about accountability, and about what it meant to live in a fair society. The system was imperfect, but Jonathan knew that by continuing to push for change, the future could be brighter. And as he stood in front of the mirror that evening, reflecting on all that had happened, Jonathan couldn't help but feel proud. He had done more than fight for his own rights. He had fought for a future where everyone, no matter their background, could feel respected and valued. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a start, and Jonathan knew that every small step mattered. A few weeks after the incident, the dust had begun to settle, but the impact of what had happened continued to resonate. Officer Mitchell had resigned from the force, though not in the way he had hoped. The pressure from the investigation, the media attention, and the public outcry had all led to the inevitable conclusion. His career in law enforcement was over. But more importantly, his actions had sparked a much-needed conversation that could no longer be ignored. Jonathan had been following the developments closely. He had been in touch with Lieutenant Graves and the department's leadership. The investigation into Officer Mitchell's behavior had concluded, and it had revealed not just individual errors, but a systemic issue within the department that needed to be addressed. The department had pledged to reform, introducing new policies aimed at preventing bias and ensuring that officers treated all people equally, regardless of their background. Though Jonathan was satisfied with the outcome, he knew this wasn't enough. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about the larger issue of discrimination, both in law enforcement and society as a whole. He continued to push for more transparency, more training, more accountability. The department had taken the first steps by instituting mandatory training on bias, profiling, and the importance of treating every individual with respect. The changes were rolling out slowly but steadily, and Jonathan was pleased to see that officers were beginning to take the training seriously. The department was also working with community leaders to improve relationships between the police and the people they served, which Jonathan saw as a crucial step in rebuilding trust. As for Officer Mitchell, his resignation had come with a heavy price. His actions had cost him not only his job but his reputation. Jonathan could see that the officer had regretted his behavior, but regret wasn't enough to undo the harm that had been done. Still, Jonathan hoped that Mitchell would learn from this experience. Perhaps in time, he could become an advocate for change, helping to prevent future mistakes. But for Jonathan, the real victory wasn't in seeing one officer leave his post. The victory was in knowing that his actions had contributed to something larger than himself. It was about creating a space for people to feel safe, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. As the weeks turned into months, Jonathan's role in pushing for police reform became a beacon of hope for others who had faced similar experiences. He had used his position not for personal gain, but to bring about real change. He had taken a stand, and that stand had rippled out, inspiring others to do the same. In the end, justice had been served, not just in the case of Officer Mitchell, but in the very real sense that people across the state were now talking openly about bias, about accountability, and about what it meant to live in a fair society. The system was imperfect, but Jonathan knew that by continuing to push for change, the future could be brighter. And as he stood in front of the mirror that evening, reflecting on all that had happened, Jonathan couldn't help but feel proud. He had done more than fight for his own rights. He had fought for a future where everyone, no matter their background, could feel respected and valued. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a start. And Jonathan knew that every small step mattered.